Longships, terror, gold, then the thunder of 150 Vikings, teaching Iberia that distance meant nothing to Northmen seeking plunder. At Pamplona in 861 AD, Viking raiders struck deep into Christian Spain and captured an entire city in Norse. Facing them, fortified walls, garrison troops, and the assumption that Northmen couldn't reach this far south. The strategic situation was impossible. The Vikings were raiding territory caught between Christian kingdoms and the Muslim emirate, not through siege warfare, not through prolonged campaign, but through something the Iberians couldn't calculate. Raiders who viewed a king's capture as just another day's work. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. The Muslim garrison fled, the Christian troops scattered, and Garcia Íñiguez, king of Pamplona, became a hostage in his own palace. By the end of this video, you'll discover how 150 changed Iberian history, how terror proved more valuable than conquest, and how one raid's ransom echoed for generations. By 861 AD, the Vikings had become the terror of Christian Europe. For nearly 70 years, since the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the Northmen had been expanding their reach with systematic brutality. Ireland had fallen to Norse control. The Seine River had become a Viking highway into the heart of Francia. England's coasts were so thoroughly raided that Anglo-Saxon kingdoms paid tribute rather than fight. These weren't random pirate attacks. This was expansion, conquest, and the establishment of Norse power across the North Sea world. But here's where it gets insane. By the 850s, Vikings weren't content with northern Europe anymore. They wanted the Mediterranean. The warm, wealthy south where Roman civilization still echoed, where Muslim caliphates controlled trade routes, where cities held gold that northern Europe couldn't match. The longship technology that had terrified Britain and Francia was about to reach waters the Northmen had never sailed before. In 859, a fleet led by Björn Ironside, legendary raider, son of the possibly mythical Ragnar Lothbrok, sailed from Scandinavia with a fleet of 62 longships carrying over 3,000 warriors. This wasn't a raid. This was an expedition into the unknown. The fleet sailed around Iberia, through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. For 3 years, they terrorized the southern shores. They raided North Africa. They struck the Balearic Islands. They attacked southern France and Italy. They sailed up the Rhone River and looted inland cities that had never seen Northmen. The Mediterranean campaign proved something crucial. Viking longships could go anywhere. Their shallow draft meant they could sail up rivers that Muslim war galleys couldn't navigate. Their ability to be rowed meant they weren't dependent on favorable winds. Their speed meant they could strike and escape before defenders could organize. The technology that had conquered the North Sea was just as effective in the warm waters of the south. Iberia became a particular target. The peninsula was divided between the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba, which controlled most of the territory, and several small Christian kingdoms clinging to survival in the north. These Christian kingdoms, Asturias, Leon, Navarre, were caught in a permanent struggle. They fought the Muslims to their south. They maneuvered against each other for advantage. They paid tribute to whoever was strongest at the moment. And now they faced a new threat, Northmen who appeared on rivers without warning and disappeared with gold before anyone could respond. Pamplona, the capital of the Kingdom of Navarre, sat in a particularly vulnerable position. The city was located on the Ebro River, which flows from the Cantabrian Mountains to the Mediterranean. This meant longships could sail from the sea, row up the Ebro, and reach Pamplona without ever leaving their boats. The city's position inland had always seemed like protection. Muslim raids from Cordoba had to march overland, giving time to prepare defenses or flee to the mountains. But rivers don't respect the same rules as armies. Garcia Íñiguez had ruled Pamplona since 851. For 10 years, he'd navigated impossible politics. He paid tribute to the Vikings who raided the Iberian coast, buying them off rather than fighting. He paid tribute to the Umayyad Emirate to avoid Muslim conquest. He maintained alliances with the Frankish kingdoms to the north, though Francia was too busy fighting its own Vikings to help. Garcia's kingdom wasn't strong. It was clever. Survival through diplomacy, tribute, and knowing when to bend rather than break. The Kingdom of Navarre was small, perhaps 50,000 people total, with Pamplona holding maybe 5,000 souls. The army was tiny by medieval standards, a few hundred professional soldiers, local militias that could be called up in emergency, and crucially, Muslim auxiliary troops hired from the emirate. These Muslim soldiers were a pragmatic solution to a strategic problem. Navarre needed troops. The emirate had professional soldiers. Gold built alliances that religion couldn't. It was the reality of Iberian politics in the 9th century. By August 861, Garcia had been paying Viking tribute for years. The Northmen who raided the coast would send messengers demanding gold. Garcia would negotiate the amount. The gold would be delivered. The Vikings would sail away. It was expensive but predictable, a system both sides understood. What Garcia didn't understand was that the Vikings weren't all operating under one command. Different fleets, different leaders, different objectives. The raiders he'd paid off weren't necessarily communicating with other Viking groups, and some Northmen weren't interested in tribute negotiations. They wanted to see how far they could push, how much they could take, how vulnerable these southern kingdoms really were. In late summer 861, 6 longships appeared on the Mediterranean coast near the Ebro Delta. Each ship carried roughly 25 warriors, 150 Northmen total. Not a huge force by Viking standards, but more than enough for a raid. These weren't the main fleet from Björn Ironside's expedition, which was ranging across the Mediterranean hitting larger targets. This was a smaller group, possibly operating independently, seeking opportunities where they found them. The longships entered the Ebro and began rowing upstream. It was hard work. The Ebro isn't a gentle river, and fighting the current required strength and coordination. But Vikings had been rowing rivers for decades. They knew how to work in shifts, how to read currents, how to make steady progress even against nature. The journey from the coast to Pamplona was roughly 200 miles of river navigation. It would have taken days, maybe a week, depending on conditions. As they rowed, the Vikings passed villages and farms. Some fled at the sight of the dragon-prowed ships. Others watched from a distance, unsure what to make of these northern boats so far from the sea. A few brave or foolish souls might have approached to trade or parley. The Vikings weren't interested in small targets. They were heading for Pamplona, and they wanted surprise on their side. The approach to Pamplona would have been visible from the city walls. 6 ships rowing up the Ebro, coming directly toward the capital. Garcia's scouts would have reported their approach. The question was, what did the scouts report? Traders? Tribute collectors? A raiding party? Garcia had paid Vikings before. The natural assumption would be that these Northmen were coming to negotiate another tribute payment. Send out representatives, hear their demands, negotiate the price, pay them off. The system had worked before. Why wouldn't it work now? What Garcia couldn't know was that these particular Vikings weren't interested in negotiating from a distance. They wanted to see the city's defenses firsthand. They wanted to gauge the garrison's readiness. They wanted to understand whether Pamplona could actually defend itself if pushed. And as the longships drew closer to the city in the early morning of what would become the most humiliating day in Garcia's reign, the Vikings made their final approach. They didn't anchor downstream and send messengers. They didn't beach the boats and camp. They rode directly to the city at dawn, when the gates would be opening for morning market, when guards would be changing shifts, when the garrison would be at its least alert. The city of Pamplona woke that August morning expecting another day of careful diplomacy and expensive tribute payments. What they got instead was 150 Northmen who understood that speed and shock were worth more than negotiation. The longships reached the walls just as dawn broke. The gates were opening. The market was beginning to stir, and the Vikings charged. The gates of Pamplona opened at dawn on a Tuesday in August 861. It was routine, market day, farmers bringing produce, merchants setting up stalls, guards yawning through their shift change. The 6 longships that had spent the night anchored just downstream suddenly burst into motion. 150 Vikings hit the oars with synchronized precision. The ships surged forward, covering the final distance to Pamplona's river gate in minutes. By the time the guards on the walls registered what was happening, the longships were already beaching on the muddy bank beneath the city's river entrance. The Vikings didn't pause to form ranks or give commands. They'd done this before in Ireland, in Francia, in England. Speed was everything. Hesitation meant defenders could close gates, rally troops, organize resistance. The Northmen poured out of the longships with practiced efficiency, axes, swords, shields, moving at a dead run toward the opening gates. The gate guards saw armed men charging and tried to respond. But they were 2 men facing 150 warriors who had just rode 200 miles specifically to hit this target. The guards died in seconds, cut down before they could even draw weapons. The Vikings were through the gate and into Pamplona's streets before anyone inside the city understood they were under attack. Here's where it gets worse. Pamplona's defenses were designed for a different kind of threat. The walls were built to resist Muslim armies marching from the south, siege engines, prolonged assaults. The garrison was positioned to defend against that scenario. But Vikings didn't siege. They infiltrated, they rushed, they created chaos faster than defenders could process what was happening. The narrow streets that would have funneled attacking armies became corridors of confusion. Citizens running, screaming, trying to understand why Northmen were in their city. The Christian garrison was scattered across multiple barracks and guard posts. They'd need time to assemble, time to get orders, time to form cohesive units, time they didn't have. The Muslim auxiliary troops were quartered near the southern gate, positioned to respond to threats from the emirate. They heard the commotion from the river gate, understood that Vikings were inside the city, and made a calculation that would haunt Garcia Iñiguez for the rest of his life. These Muslim soldiers were hired troops. They were paid to defend against Muslim armies, not to die fighting Norse raiders. They'd heard the stories about Vikings, about the berserkers who felt no pain, about the axes that split shields and helmets, about the crews who terrorized the entire Mediterranean. The Muslim garrison abandoned their posts and fled through the southern gate. Professional soldiers, trained and equipped, simply left rather than fight. It was a pragmatic military decision. These weren't their people, this wasn't their kingdom, and dying for Christian gold suddenly seemed like a terrible bargain. Within an hour of the Vikings entering the city, Pamplona's Muslim auxiliary force had disappeared into the countryside. The Christian garrison, realizing they were now unsupported and facing raiders who'd already penetrated the city, scattered. Some fled to their homes. Others retreated to defensive positions and waited to see what the Vikings wanted. A few tried to organize resistance and were cut down by Northmen who moved through the streets with terrifying purpose. The Vikings weren't interested in fighting the garrison. They were headed for the palace. That's where the gold was. That's where the king was. And a captured king was worth more than a dead garrison. Garcia Iñiguez was in his private quarters when the first screams reached the palace. He'd been expecting tribute negotiations, not an assault. By the time he understood what was happening, Vikings inside the city, garrison fleeing, no organized defense, it was already too late to escape. The palace guards tried to hold the main entrance, 20 men against the Viking vanguard. It was over in minutes. The Northmen used their shields to create a wedge, push through the doorway, and carve through defenders who were brave, but overwhelmed. The palace's internal layout meant nothing. Vikings had stormed palaces before, knew how to search rooms systematically, knew how to corner prey. Garcia was found in the throne room with his family, his wife, his children, his closest advisors. They'd retreated to the most defensible room in the palace and waited, hoping the garrison would rally, hoping this was somehow a misunderstanding. What they got instead was Vikings who burst through the doors with axes ready and no interest in negotiation. The lead Viking, sources don't record his name, just that he commanded the raid, looked at Garcia on his throne and made a gesture that transcended language barriers. "You're coming with us. The king of Pamplona, who had ruled for a decade through careful diplomacy and strategic tribute payments, was now a prisoner in his own palace. But wait, it gets worse. The Vikings didn't kill Garcia. They needed him alive. A dead king was worthless. A living king, with family who wanted him back, was worth a fortune. Garcia was escorted from the throne room at axe point, taken into the palace courtyard where his household could see him, where his remaining guards could understand the situation. The message was clear: resist, and the king dies. Cooperate, and he lives. The Christian garrison, what remained of it, saw their king in Viking custody and collapsed. You can't fight when the enemy holds your ruler hostage. You can't organize resistance when every move might get your king killed. The few pockets of defenders who'd been preparing to fight melted away. Pamplona had fallen without a proper battle. Speed, shock, and audacity had defeated walls, garrison, and auxiliary troops in less than 3 hours. By mid-morning, the Vikings controlled the city. They'd taken perhaps a dozen casualties, wounded men from the initial rush, nothing serious. Pamplona's defences had cost them almost nothing. The garrison had fled or hidden. The Muslim auxiliaries were gone, and Garcia Iñiguez, along with his family, was surrounded by Northmen who were now methodically looting his kingdom's capital. The looting was systematic, not chaotic. Vikings had refined this process over decades. Teams went through the palace taking everything valuable: gold, silver, jewels, fine cloth, weapons. Other teams hit the churches. Ecclesiastical silver was particularly valuable, easy to melt down and transport. The wealthier merchant houses were stripped of their portable wealth. The Vikings knew they had limited time before word spread, and someone tried to organize a rescue. Garcia was forced to watch. The Vikings kept him under guard in the palace courtyard, where he could see his city being systematically plundered. It was psychological warfare. Make the king watch his powerlessness, demonstrate that his authority meant nothing, soften him up for what came next. The ransom negotiation. The ransom demand, when it came, was staggering. 60,000 gold dinars. Some sources say 70,000. Either way, it was an enormous sum, equivalent to years of Pamplona's total tribute payments to both Vikings and Muslims combined. It was more than the kingdom's entire treasury held. It was designed to be painful, to require scrambling, to force Garcia's family to liquidate assets and beg for help. Garcia's brother, Fortun Garces, became the primary negotiator. He wasn't in Pamplona when the raid happened. He was probably in one of Navarre's other towns, or out of the kingdom entirely. When word reached him that his brother was a Viking prisoner and ransom was demanded, he faced an impossible situation: pay the ransom and bankrupt the kingdom, refuse and watch Garcia die, probably followed by a succession crisis that would tear Navarre apart. Fortun chose survival over pride. He began gathering the ransom. The kingdom's treasury was emptied. Church silver was collected. The bishops had no choice but to contribute to their king's release. Wealthy families were pressured to give what they could. Fortun probably borrowed from neighboring kingdoms, promising future tribute or territorial concessions. It took weeks to assemble the gold. During those weeks, the Vikings occupied Pamplona. They weren't worried about rescue attempts. No one was coming. The Muslim emirate in Córdoba heard about the raid and made a calculated decision not to intervene. Why help a Christian king who'd just been humiliated? Let the Northmen have their gold. The weakness on display was useful information. The other Christian kingdoms were too busy with their own problems and too afraid of Viking retaliation to attempt a rescue. Garcia watched his kingdom being looted, his authority being stripped away, his people paying the price for his survival. The humiliation was complete. He was alive, but powerless, present, but irrelevant. A king who couldn't protect his city, couldn't command his garrison, couldn't stop his family from being held hostage by pagan raiders who'd sailed from the other end of Europe. After approximately 3 weeks, sources vary on the exact duration, the ransom was ready. 60,000 or 70,000 gold dinars transported to Pamplona under Viking supervision. The Northmen counted it carefully. They'd come a long way for this gold. They wanted to make sure they got every piece. When the count was complete and the Vikings were satisfied, they released Garcia and his family, unharmed as promised. Vikings had a reputation to maintain. If you paid the ransom, you got your people back alive. It was good business. Future victims would be more willing to pay if they knew the Northmen honored their deals. The 6 longships loaded with gold, silver, and plunder departed Pamplona the same way they'd arrived. They rode down the Ebro, past the same villages that had watched them ascend, back toward the Mediterranean. No one pursued them. No one dared. The Vikings had proven that Pamplona couldn't defend itself, that tributary relationships meant nothing when raiders wanted to test limits. That distance from the coast wasn't protection, when Northmen had longships and determination. Garcia stood on the walls and watched them disappear downriver. He was free, technically, but his kingdom was bankrupted, his authority was shattered, and everyone in Iberia now knew that the king of Pamplona had been taken prisoner in his own palace by 150 raiders. The humiliation would never fade. The gold was gone, and the Vikings had learned that Iberian kingdoms would pay extraordinary ransoms to get their kings back. As the longships disappeared down the Ebro, carrying wealth that had taken generations to accumulate, Pamplona faced the grim arithmetic of survival. The city was intact physically. The Vikings hadn't burned buildings or slaughtered citizens. But economically and politically, Navarre was devastated in ways that walls and garrison couldn't measure. The ransom of 60,000 to 70,000 gold dinars had emptied every source of wealth in the kingdom. The royal treasury was bare. Church silver had been melted down and handed over. Wealthy families had contributed their savings under pressure. Even with all of that, Fortune Garces had probably borrowed from neighboring kingdoms to make up the difference. Those debts would come due with interest, territorial concessions, or political favors that would bind Navarre for years. But the financial cost was only part of the calculation. Garcia Iñiguez returned to his throne as a king who had been captured in his own palace, held prisoner while his city was looted, forced to watch Vikings systematically strip his kingdom of portable wealth. In medieval society, where kingship derived from the ability to protect your people and project strength, this was catastrophic to royal authority. The Muslim auxiliary garrison that had fled never returned. Why would they? They'd been hired to defend against Muslim armies from the Emirate, not to die fighting Norse raiders. Their departure had been pragmatic military calculation, but it left Garcia without a significant portion of his defensive force. He'd have to rebuild his garrison from scratch, recruit new troops, find soldiers willing to serve a king who'd proven unable to defend his own capital. The Christian garrison that had scattered during the raid trickled back, but their morale was shattered. They'd abandoned their posts. They'd watched their king become a prisoner. They'd hidden while Vikings looted their city. These were professional failures that no amount of excuse-making could erase. The military culture of shame and honor meant these men would carry their failure for the rest of their careers. Here's what your history teacher never told you. The raid on Pamplona wasn't just about gold. It was a demonstration that changed how every kingdom in Iberia thought about defense. The Vikings had proven that walls didn't matter if you could approach by river, that garrisons didn't matter if you struck before they could assemble, that auxiliary troops were unreliable when facing enemies they'd only heard about in terrifying stories, and most importantly, that capturing kings was possible if you moved fast enough and were willing to take the risk. The Muslim emirate in Cordoba had watched the entire episode with keen interest. Emir Muhammad Mefeh, who ruled the Umayyad Emirate from 852 to 886, received detailed reports of what had happened. A Christian king captured by pagan Northmen, Muslim troops fleeing rather than fighting, a kingdom bankrupted paying ransom. This was valuable intelligence about Christian weakness, about internal divisions, about how these northern kingdoms could be pressured. The emirate didn't need to attack Navarre immediately. The Vikings had already done the work of destabilizing the kingdom. but the knowledge that Christian kingdoms were vulnerable to this kind of lightning raid, that their defenses were optimized for the wrong kind of threat, that their internal politics were fragile, all of this informed Cordoba's strategic calculations for years to come. For Garcia personally, the trauma was profound. Medieval chronicles don't spend much time on psychological impact, but we can infer from what followed. A king who'd spent a decade carefully managing impossible political situations through diplomacy and tribute had been rendered powerless in wars. He'd been forced to watch his city looted, his people terrorized, his family held hostage. He'd been released only because his brother could scrape together enough gold to buy his freedom. The political consequences played out over the following years. Garcia's authority within his own kingdom was permanently damaged. Nobles who'd accepted his leadership before now questioned whether he could actually protect them. Decisions that he might have made unilaterally before now required consultation, negotiation, careful management of factions who saw weakness. The raid had shown that the king couldn't guarantee security, which meant the king's power to command was diminished. His relationship with neighboring Christian kingdoms changed too. Asturias, Leon, and the other northern Christian realms had watched Navarre's humiliation. They'd seen that paying Vikings off wasn't permanent protection. They'd learned that small kingdoms operating independently were vulnerable in ways that larger unified defenses might prevent. This didn't lead to immediate unification. Iberian Christian politics were too fractious for that, but it planted seeds of strategic thinking about collective defense that would grow over time. The Vikings, meanwhile, had learned something crucial. Iberian kingdoms would pay enormous ransoms to recover their rulers. The raid on Pamplona became a template. In the years that followed, Viking raids on the Iberian coast intensified. The 860s and 870s saw repeated Norse attacks on Christian and Muslim targets alike. Some were simple smash and grab raids. Others attempted to replicate Pamplona's success, capture someone important, demand ransom, sail away rich. Not all of these raids succeeded. Iberian kingdoms learned and adapted. Permanent garrisons were stationed specifically to watch rivers. Cities fortified their river approaches. Early warning systems were established. Watchtowers, signal fires, mounted scouts who could spread word faster than longships could row. The defenses that had been optimized for land-based Muslim armies began to account for waterborne Norse raiders, but the damage to Navarre specifically was lasting. The kingdom never fully recovered economically from the ransom payment. The treasury that had been emptied took decades to refill. The tribute payments that Garcia had to continue making to both Vikings and Muslims, because the raid didn't exempt him from those obligations, meant the kingdom operated at a permanent deficit. Infrastructure projects were delayed. Military recruitment suffered. The administrative state that Garcia had been building slowly degraded. Garcia Iñiguez died in 870, 9 years after the raid. He was probably in his early 40s, not old by modern standards, but the physical and psychological toll of his captivity and the stress of trying to rebuild his kingdom from bankruptcy had aged him. Contemporary sources don't give details of his death, just the date. He was succeeded by his son, also named Garcia, who inherited a kingdom still recovering from the humiliation and financial devastation of 861. The succession itself was complicated by the raid's legacy. Garcia's authority had been so damaged that his son didn't inherit the same level of automatic respect. Fortun Garces, who had negotiated the ransom and saved his brother's life, had his own power base and his own claim to authority. The internal politics of Navarre for the next generation were shaped by that tension, the king who'd been captured versus the brother who'd rescued him. Here's the part historians still debate. Did the raid on Pamplona change the strategic balance in Iberia, or was it just one dramatic instant in a larger pattern? The answer is probably both. The raid itself was relatively small, 150 Vikings, 3 weeks, 1 city. But the demonstration effect was enormous. Every kingdom in Iberia, Christian and Muslim alike, had to recalculate their defensive strategies based on what the Northmen had proven possible. The Muslim Emirate increased pressure on Christian kingdoms over the following decades, exploiting the weakness and division that events like Pamplona revealed. The Christian kingdoms, in turn, began slowly moving toward more unified defensive postures, recognizing that isolation made them vulnerable. The process took centuries, but the path from divided Christian kingdoms to the eventual Reconquista can trace some of its strategic logic back to lessons learned from Viking raids like Pamplona. The Vikings themselves continued their Mediterranean adventures through the 860s. Björn Ironside's fleet eventually returned to Scandinavia in 862, having spent 3 years raiding from North Africa to Italy. The smaller groups that had operated semi-independently, like the force that hit Pamplona, gradually withdrew as well. The Mediterranean campaigns had proven profitable but difficult. The distances were vast, the logistics complex, and southern kingdoms were learning to defend against Norse tactics. By the 870s, Viking activity in the Mediterranean declined. The Northmen turned their attention back to Britain, Ireland, and Francia, where the targets were closer and the political situations more favourable to Norse settlement and conquest. But for one brief period in the late 850s and early 860s, Vikings had shown they could operate anywhere, even in waters thousands of miles from Scandinavia. The longships that had terrorized Pamplona might have ended up anywhere, broken apart for timber in Scandinavia, sunk in storms on the return voyage, repurposed for later raids. The Vikings who'd captured Garcia might have gone on to raid other targets, or retired as wealthy men, or died in later battles. The sources don't tell us. They care about kings and kingdoms, not individual raiders. What the sources do tell us is that the raid on Pamplona was remembered. Frankish chronicles recorded it. Later Spanish chronicles mentioned it. Arabic sources noted the Christian king's humiliation and the Muslim garrison's flight. The event was significant enough that multiple cultures with different agendas all thought it worth documenting. That's how we know it happened, how we can reconstruct the basic facts, even when details are sparse or contradictory. The gold that Garcia's family scraped together to pay the ransom, 60,000 to 70,000 dinars of Iberian wealth, went north with the Vikings. Some of it was melted down and reformed into Norse jewelry and artifacts. Some was used to fund other raids or to buy land in Scandinavia. Some might have been traded to merchants from Constantinople or Baghdad who didn't care where the gold came from. The economic impact rippled outward from that transfer, wealth flowing from Iberia to the Viking world in a pattern that would repeat throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. For the people of Pamplona, the raid was a trauma that passed into local memory. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the day the Northmen came up the river, about the king being taken prisoner, about the weeks when Vikings ruled the city and everyone waited to see if they'd live or die, about the gold being carried away and the years of poverty that followed. These stories shaped local identity, local understanding of vulnerability, local distrust of promises that the kingdom was safe. The Viking Age reached its southern limit at places like Pamplona. The Northmen could get this far, could strike this deep, but they couldn't hold territory at these distances. The logistics didn't work. The strategic depth didn't exist, so they raided, they captured, they demanded ransoms, and they sailed away. It was profitable, dramatic, terrifying, but ultimately temporary. Garcia Iñiguez lived 9 more years after his humiliation, trying to rebuild what the Vikings had taken, trying to restore his authority, trying to leave his son a kingdom that wasn't defined by its worst moment. He succeeded, partially. Navarre survived. The dynasty continued. The kingdom maintained its independence for centuries. But the raid was never forgotten. The gold was never recovered. And the lesson that 150 raiders could shatter a kingdom in hours echoed through Iberian politics for generations. The years following Garcia's death in 870 revealed the full scope of what the 861 raid had cost Navarre. The kingdom that Garcia Iñiguez II inherited from his father was fundamentally weaker than the one Garcia I had ruled before the Vikings came. The treasury was still recovering, the military was rebuilding from the garrison's humiliation, and most crucially, the psychological damage lingered. Navarre knew it could be violated, that its defences were penetrable, that its king could be taken. The succession itself proceeded without major crisis, but the internal tensions were real. Fortuny Garcés, who had negotiated his brother's release and gathered the ransom, held significant influence. He'd saved the kingdom when Garcia couldn't save himself. That created a complicated political dynamic, the son of the captured king ruling while the uncle who'd paid the ransom still lived and commanded loyalty. Eventually, Fortuny himself would briefly rule Navarre in the 880s before being captured by Muslims and spending years as a prisoner in Córdoba. The cycle of captivity and humiliation continued, but the raid's consequences extended far beyond Navarre's borders. The Viking demonstration that Iberian kingdoms were vulnerable had ripple effects across Christian Spain. Other kingdoms began fortifying their river approaches. Permanent watch posts were established on major waterways. Early warning systems, signal fires, mounted couriers, coastal lookouts were expanded and formalized. The defensive mindset shifted from protecting against land-based Muslim armies to accounting for waterborne Norse raiders who could appear anywhere with navigable water. The Viking raids on Iberia continued through the 860s and 870s, though none achieved quite the dramatic success of Pamplona. Raiders hit coastal towns, monasteries, and isolated settlements. Some demanded tribute, others simply looted and left. The pattern established by earlier raids, strike fast, take what you can carry, disappear before organized resistance arrives, became standard operating procedure for Norse operations in the south. The Muslim emirate watched this pattern with calculated interest. Every Viking raid on Christian kingdoms provided intelligence about Christian weaknesses, tested Christian defenses, and created opportunities for Córdoba to exploit. When Vikings struck Christian territory, it diverted resources and attention away from the Muslim-Christian frontier. When Christian kings paid Viking ransoms, it weakened their ability to resist Muslim pressure. The emirate didn't ally with the Vikings. The relationship wasn't that coordinated, but they certainly benefited from Norse activity destabilizing Christian Spain. The economic drain on Christian kingdoms was cumulative and severe. The ransom Navarre paid in 861 was just one payment in a broader pattern of tribute, protection money, and emergency ransoms that flowed from Iberian kingdoms to Viking raiders throughout this period. Gold and silver that could have funded infrastructure, military expansion, or administrative development instead went north to Scandinavia or was distributed among Norse raiders. This capital extraction weakened Christian Spain at precisely the moment when unified resistance against the emirate would have been most beneficial. Here's where even the chronicles struggle. The exact number of Viking raids on Iberia in the 860s, 870s is unclear. Sources are fragmentary, biased, and often focus only on the most dramatic incidents, but archaeological evidence, hoards of Iberian silver found in Scandinavia, Arabic coins discovered in Norse contexts, weapon finds that suggest conflict, confirms that the raiding was extensive and profitable. The Vikings weren't just hitting one or two targets. They were systematically extracting wealth from the entire Iberian periphery. The raid on Pamplona specifically became a reference point in later negotiations. When Vikings approached other Iberian kingdoms demanding tribute, the implicit threat was clear: pay us now, or we'll do to you what we did to Garcia Iñiguez. The memory of a king captured, a city looted, a kingdom bankrupted, that memory had strategic value. It made subsequent tribute demands more credible and made resistance seem more costly. By the 880s, Viking activity in Iberia began to decline. The Mediterranean campaigns that had brought Northmen this far south were winding down. The logistics of operating thousands of miles from Scandinavian bases were challenging. The southern kingdoms had adapted their defences, and opportunities in Britain, Ireland, and Francia, closer to home, easier to supply, more suitable for permanent Norse settlement, drew Viking attention back north. But the legacy of those decades remained. Christian Iberia had been forced to acknowledge a new category of threat. The Vikings had proven that geographic isolation wasn't protection, that walls designed for one kind of warfare were vulnerable to another, that speed and audacity could defeat numerical superiority. These lessons informed Iberian military thinking for generations. The Frankish chronicles that documented the Pamplona raid treated it as one incident among many in the broader Viking age. From the Frankish perspective, Norse raiders hitting Spain was surprising mainly because of the distance involved. The tactics, river navigation, lightning raids, hostage-taking, ransom demands, were all familiar from Viking operations in Francia itself. What was novel was the geographic reach, the proof that nowhere in Christian Europe was truly safe from longships. Arabic sources, viewing the events from the Muslim perspective, noted the raid primarily as evidence of Christian weakness. Ibn Hayyan, writing in the 11th century but using earlier sources, described how Christian kings were so vulnerable that pagan Northmen could capture them with impunity. For Muslim chroniclers, the raid confirmed that the Christian kingdoms were fractious, poorly defended, and unable to protect their own rulers, all useful propaganda points in the ongoing religious and political conflict between Christian and Muslim Iberia. Later, Spanish chronicles, written centuries after the events, sometimes embellished the story. Medieval writers loved dramatic narratives about captured kings, Viking terror, and impossible ransoms. Some later versions exaggerated the numbers, claiming hundreds of Vikings or inflating the ransom to absurd amounts. But the core facts remained consistent across sources. Vikings came up the Ebro, took Pamplona, captured Garcia, demanded and received enormous ransom, then left. The basic narrative was too well documented to fabricate entirely. Modern historians studying the raid have access to all these sources, plus archaeological evidence and comparative analysis of Viking tactics elsewhere. The consensus is that the raid happened essentially as described, a relatively small Viking force exploiting surprise and speed to take a fortified city and capture its king. The ransom figures vary depending on which source you trust, but all agree it was enormous relative to Navarre's resources. The lasting damage to Garcia's authority and Navarre's economy is undeniable. Military historians study Pamplona as a case study in asymmetric warfare. How does a small mobile force defeat a larger, better positioned enemy? Speed, surprise, targeting leadership before defenses can organize, creating psychological shock that prevents coordinated resistance, exploiting assumptions about where threats come from and what kinds of attacks are possible. The Vikings at Pamplona used all of these, and medieval defenders had no doctrine for countering them. The raid also demonstrates the economic logic of Viking Age warfare. The 150 warriors who captured Pamplona each received a share of 60,000 plus gold dinars. Even accounting for the costs of the expedition and shares going to ship owners and commanders, the individual payout for each warrior was likely substantial, possibly more than a year's income from farming or other work in Scandinavia. This economic incentive drove Viking expansion. Raiding wasn't just about adventure or glory. It was profitable in ways that staying home wasn't. The psychological warfare component was equally important. Vikings cultivated their reputation for terror deliberately. The stories of berserkers, of warriors who didn't feel pain, of axes that could split shields and skulls, these stories preceded the raiders and multiplied their effectiveness. When the Muslim garrison at Pamplona heard Vikings were inside the city, they fled not because of what they'd personally experienced, but because of what they'd heard. Reputation multiplied force. For Garcia Iñiguez personally, the raid defined his legacy in ways that his entire previous decade of relatively successful rule couldn't overcome. Medieval chroniclers remembered him primarily as the king who was captured by Vikings. His diplomatic achievements, his careful management of Navarre's impossible position between Muslim and Frankish powers. His 10 years of maintaining independence, all of that was overshadowed by 3 weeks as a hostage. History is often that cruel. The longships that carried the ransom away from Pamplona sailed back to Scandinavia with more than gold. They carried proof that Iberian kingdoms would pay extraordinary sums to recover their kings. They carried knowledge about river routes, defensive weaknesses, and political divisions. They carried stories that would inspire other Vikings to attempt similar raids. The information was as valuable as the gold. Within a generation, the immediate memory of the raid began to fade in Navarre itself. Garcia I died. Garcia II died. New kings faced new challenges, the daily struggles of governing, managing noble factions, negotiating with Muslims, maintaining alliances, collecting taxes, overwhelmed the historical memory of that August day in 861. But the structural consequences remained: the empty treasury, the weakened garrison, the knowledge that security was fragile. When the last Viking longships departed Iberian waters in the 880s, they left behind kingdoms that had been fundamentally changed. Not conquered, the Vikings never tried to hold territory in Iberia. Not destroyed, the kingdoms survived and eventually thrived, but changed in their understanding of vulnerability, in their defensive strategies, in their psychological relationship to security. The Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia had learned that paying tribute didn't guarantee safety, that walls didn't guarantee protection, and that kings could become prisoners in their own palaces. The Umayyad Emirate, having observed all of this, applied its own lessons. Christian weakness was exploitable, divided kingdoms were vulnerable. The defensive focus on riverborne raiders created opportunities for land-based Muslim advances. Over the following decades, Cordoba increased pressure on Christian territories, exploiting the disunity and economic weakness that Viking raids had revealed and exacerbated. The eventual Christian reconquista of Iberia, which would take centuries and fundamentally reshape the peninsula, emerged partly from lessons learned during this period. Christian kingdoms slowly, painfully learned that unity provided security that isolated independence couldn't, that coordinated defenses could resist threats that individual kingdoms couldn't handle alone. That shared intelligence about enemy movements was more valuable than keeping secrets from rival Christian states. The process was slow, frequently reversed, and interrupted by continued internal conflicts. But the strategic logic that eventually produced more unified Christian resistance had roots in humiliations like Pamplona. When 150 Vikings sailed up the Ebro in August 861, they thought they were conducting a raid, capture a king, demand ransom, get rich, routine Viking business. What they actually did was demonstrate that the entire strategic balance of Iberia was based on assumptions about where threats could come from and how fast they could strike. Those assumptions were wrong, and proving them wrong changed everything. The raid lasted weeks. The occupation was temporary. The Vikings sailed away and never came back to Pamplona specifically, but the fear lasted generations. The economic damage took decades to repair. The psychological wound to royal authority never fully healed, and the lesson that no kingdom in Iberia was safe from determined raiders with longships and audacity echoed through strategic calculations for the rest of the century. Garcia Iñiguez, who had spent a decade carefully navigating impossible politics, learned in 3 August weeks that all his careful diplomacy meant nothing when warriors who'd rowed from Scandinavia wanted to test whether a king could be taken. He survived. His kingdom survived. But survival came at a price counted in gold, humiliation, and the permanent knowledge that security was an illusion that 150 men with axes could shatter in hours. The longships are gone. The gold is scattered. The warriors are dust. But the raid on Pamplona remains, preserved in chronicles, excavated from archaeological sites, studied by military historians, remembered as the day Vikings proved that terror was more valuable than conquest and that audacity could defeat armies. 150 raiders changed Iberian history not by staying, but by showing what was possible, and then sailing away with a king's ransom, leaving everyone who heard the story to wonder, could it happen here?